Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series, where today I'm going to be telling you the story of Florence Nightingale. I'm sure that most of us already know the basics of the tale of the Lady with the Lamp, but as always with my history series, we're going to take a deep dive into her life and take a look at how she changed the course of the nursing career forever. She was also a talented statistician and mathematician. I feel a certain affinity to Florence Nightingale because a couple of years ago me and my great nan were going through our family tree and I was very excited to see Florence Nightingale pop up. I've spent the last few days searching my room desperately to find this family tree that I'd photocopied, but apparently it's disappeared. I really hope to find it when I move house in a few weeks, but I just don't know where it's gone. So I can't tell you exactly how I'm related to Florence Nightingale, but if I remember correctly, it was not by blood. It was through her sister Parthenope's marriage to Harry Verney. So if anybody's wondering where I get my wonderful, kind and caring nature from, it's from the Nightingales. Obviously, even though I'm not blood related, that's what I'm going to tell people. Anyway, enough about me. You're not here to hear about me. Let's talk about Florence Nightingale. But first, of course, this video is sponsored by Magellan TV. As you probably know, we have an ongoing sponsorship and I know that so many of you have already signed up to Magellan TV. So today I'm going to make a couple of documentary recommendations first, both of which this week are actually in the new release section. So even if you are already subscribed, you might not have seen these ones yet. So first up we have Eugenics, Science's Greatest Scandal, which is a two-part series about, you guessed it, eugenics, which according to the dictionary is the science of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. This is a super interesting two-parter and I'm very glad it's a two-parter because it's something that requires a very deep dive. Eugenics isn't just an idea of the past, it's much more complex than that and it's just so interesting to learn about. And the second documentary I have to recommend is Seven Women, the Irish Suffragettes. As soon as I saw this one, it called out to me because when I think of the suffragettes, I tend to think of the British and American women, but of course this movement that was spread around the entire world. In 1916, 7 men signed the Proclamation of the Irish Republic and kick off the Easter Rising. These men involved went on to be famous, but all of the women were forgotten. And in deeply Catholic Ireland, being a suffragette looks slightly different than it did elsewhere. Again, I highly recommend this. For those of you who haven't signed up yet, Magellan TV is a streaming service dedicated purely to documentaries. I advocate education and bettering yourself in your knowledge at every opportunity, so I really cannot recommend Magellan TV enough. They have everything from true crime, science, history, nature and everything in between, with new programmes added weekly can be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K as well. There's never been a better time than now to dedicate your time to educating yourself and learning something new. Florence Nightingale was born on the 12th of May 1820 to William and Frances Nightingale, a very wealthy British family. She was born in Florence, Italy, hence the name, and she was actually their second child, their second daughter, with her older sister Frances Parthenope, who was born a year earlier, also named after her place of birth, a Greek settlement which is now part of Naples. The Nightingales were a fairly unusual family considering the time. William was born William Shaw, but inherited the name Nightingale from his great uncle Peter Nightingale, who essentially wanted an heir to his estate. He would give the estate and all of his riches to William as long as he carried on the family name, a pretty good deal if you ask me. Frances also came from a very wealthy family and took pride in socialising, working her way up that social ladder, a trait which Florence and her would butt heads about in the future. Florence hated attention. Her maternal grandfather was abolitionist and Member of Parliament William Smith. He was incredibly liberal for Georgian England. He was a social reformer who fought for social justice, the prison reform and the abolition of slavery. William Nightingale was also fairly liberal for the time, maybe it was just the name William. In a time when it was considered controversial for women to be educated, William thought that it was incredibly important that his daughters be as highly educated as he was. After their marriage, William and Frances decided to go on an extended honeymoon, travelling around Europe for a couple of years, hence why both their daughters were born in Italy. They were upper middle class, they were very wealthy, and the year after Florence was born they moved back to England, where their daughters would be brought up in 2 family homes, Embley Park in Hampshire and Leahurst in Derbyshire. The early education of Parthenope and Florence was put into the hands of a governess. but from what I could gather, this particular governess was considered strict for the time, but would probably be considered downright abusive for nowadays. So eventually their father took over and provided them with the same classical education that he'd received at Cambridge. Classics, philosophy, mathematics, modern languages. Florence spoke multiple languages including fluent English, German, French and Italian and more. She had this thirst for knowledge and just loved learning. She was incredibly academic and, according to the BBC, displayed an extraordinary ability for collecting and analysing data, which she would use to great effect in later life. A next excerpt from a letter written by William to his daughter while she was a teenager reads, "Never sit down to tea without changing. If not changed, it must be taken upstairs. Some new poetry to be learned and 2 things prepared for this evening. I always prefer varied poetry. Practice sacred music for half an hour. If any of these things are omitted, you will work them up the next day." So William was very disciplined and expected his daughters to be disciplined as well. He was aware of the privilege that they had and intended to make the most of it. His daughters were going to be the best, they were going to be educated. And whilst it seems that Florence may have found her childhood very constricting, perhaps found her parents to be overbearing, it's due to this that she would later change the course of the entire world. Towards the end of the 1830s, the Nightingales took their now teenage daughters on a tour of Europe, something a lot of upper middle class families did as a way to educate and refine gentlewomen, make them into proper ladies. Except it kinda had the opposite effect when Florence met Mary Clark in Paris. Mary Clark was a different kind of woman, and Florence would write in her journal that whilst Mary was incapable of boring anyone, she did not care for Florence's experience and had no respect for class. Mary didn't care if you were rich. She hated the boundaries put on herself by simply being a woman, so she refused to conform. Most considered Mary to be eccentric, but Florence enjoyed her company and they formed a very close friendship, despite Mary being 27 years older. Frances, Florence's mother, had always insisted that a woman is to be a woman. She enforced the gender stereotypes of the time and thought Florence should conform to them. But Mary taught teenage Florence that simply didn't have to be the case. You could be a woman and be brilliant. For the rest of her trip around Europe, Florence would focus on the educational aspect. She recorded in her journal detailed notes of population statistics, hospitals and charitable institutions. She was incredibly interested in mathematics and would later go on to receive even further tuition in the subject, despite her mother's disapproval. Her mother and her sister expected her to become a wife and mother first and foremost. Anything else that interested Florence was just to be a hobby. But Florence, of course, had other ideas. She became convinced that God was calling her to his service. She was a religious woman, but some describe her particular religious beliefs as radical. She was highly critical of the Church of England, believing that it was too patriarchal, and she disagreed with the common prayers of the time, believing them to be insulting to God's majesty. Florence was the kind of person who questioned everything. She couldn't take anything at face value and hated being treated as less than she was, and therefore it only stood to reason that she was aggravated when God was treated as less than he was, or as less than she considered him to be anyway. It actually seems like Florence's insistence to learn was based in her religion. Knowledge made her feel closer to God. So when she started to feel like God was pushing her to care for people, pushing her towards nursing, who was she to say no? But when she mentioned that she wanted to become a nurse to her parents, they said no. A hard no. In fact, they forbade her from pursuing it. Back in the 1800s, nursing wasn't viewed as it was nowadays. It was a job that was considered to be on the same social level as prostitution, something done by drunks and the poor, lowly menial labour. It wasn't the done thing to want to care for the ill. For hundreds of years, hospitals were often housed inside monasteries and churches. Nuns and monks worked as the nurses. And once Protestant Reformation came in the 17th century, a lot of the monasteries and churches shut down, hospitals along with them. And nurses became something of ill repute. It certainly was not the expected career of a woman of Florence Nightingale's social stature. She was expected to marry a man of means and live off him, but this was never in the cards for Florence, despite being an attractive young woman. She certainly wasn't short of suitors. People said that although she could be quite severe, which I take to be the Victorian way of saying resting bitch face, she was charming and had a radiant smile when she felt inclined. She did have a 9-year courtship with politician and poet Richard Monckton Milnes, but she eventually rejected him because she believed her calling in life was caring for others, nursing. Despite the fact that her parents had forbid her, she was determined to get there eventually, and men would just be a distraction. So she continued to travel around Europe. In 1847 she met a Sidney Herbert in Rome, a politician who had formerly been Secretary of War. This would become a monumental relationship in her life, and it's probably due to this meeting the world is where it's at right now. Florence travelled and wrote. At one point she sailed up the Nile. She rejected any man who showed her any interest, just going where she believed that God was leading her. Throughout all of her travels, her greatest goal was to eventually persuade her parents to allow her to train as a nurse. As independent a woman as she was still held within the confines of society. She was still a woman, and she needed her parents' permission. But by 1850, Florence was 30 years old, and her father finally realised that she was unlikely to ever marry, so he relented. She could go and train as a nurse in Germany, where she underwent 3 months of nursing training at the Institute of Protestant Deaconesses. She fully trained, and by August 1853, Florence moved back to London, where she was awarded the role of superintendent at the Establishment for Gentlewomen During Illness, which was a women's hospital, on Harley Street. She was finally a nurse. But the job role came with its challenges, because nursing back then was, for lack of a better word, just plain disgusting. The conditions were incredibly unsanitary. People died from what are now very preventable diseases at extraordinary rates. And there was a general lack of respect for nurses as well. Florence made it her mission to improve hygiene practices and therefore death rates in the process. But at this point she was just an unknown woman, controversially working as a nurse. Her fame wouldn't come until the Crimean War. As a quick explanation, the Crimean War was fought between 1853 and 1856, in which Russia eventually lost the Ottoman Empire, which is the UK, Sardinia and France. In no shock to anyone, it was a war fought over religion. As the war was fought, reports were coming back to Britain about the horrific conditions of the British Army hospitals and the state of the wounded. More people were dying than needed, and in a war you needed as many people alive as possible. Earlier I mentioned the Secretary of War, Sidney Herbert. He knew that something needed to be done over in Crimea, and he knew Florence and her journey in nursing very well. She was really beginning to make a name for herself. So Herbert appoints Florence to take 38 nurses to the military hospital in Scutari in Turkey. This was the first time ever that a woman had been allowed to officially serve in the army, and Florence wasn't about to mess this up. When she arrived at the hospital in early November 1854, she was shocked at the conditions. Medicines were in short supply, the medical staff were overworked and generally just indifferent, they didn't care. Hygiene practices weren't just poor, they were non-existent, and the floor was covered with an inch-thick layer of feces. Soldiers were lying on said floor instead of in beds. Diseases such as cholera and typhus were rife, and Florence realised that injured soldiers were 7 times more likely to die from preventable diseases in hospital than they were to die on the battlefield. So she immediately puts her nurses to work, cleaning and implementing easy changes, such as enforcing a 3-foot distance between soldiers to lower the spreading of disease, and washing their hands often. These things work, people. There's a reason why they're being promoted today in COVID times. Florence sent an urgent plea to the Times newspaper back in Britain, urging the government to help create a solution to the problems faced by the hospitals in Scutari. And in response, the government sent out a sanitary commission just 6 months later, who implemented even more changes. They flushed the sewers several times a day, they disinfected the latrines, improved ventilation, and moved the horses that were kept in the hospital basement to a different location. These were tiny things that had a huge effect. Of course, being a female, Florence had to fight against the military every single step of the way to get her voice heard, but she wasn't exactly a wallflower. She got what she wanted. She improved those conditions. And as you can guess, after these improvements were made, the death rate in the hospital improved dramatically. Now, Florence wasn't only a nurse. She had this love for mathematics and statistics. So whilst in Turkey, she constantly collected and collated data. It was through this data that she decided that poor sanitation was the reason behind this high amount of deaths in the first place. She kept an incredibly tight record-keeping system and eventually used this data to calculate the mortality rate in the hospital. Within just 2 months of her arrival, the mortality rate dropped from 60% to 42.7%. 6 months later, this dropped just 2.2%. That's 60% down to just 2.2% of people dying after they'd entered the hospital. Florence always refused to claim credit for this though, because as far as she was concerned, she was just doing her job. It was during this time in Turkey that she essentially changed the face of nursing forever, but it wasn't down to just the numbers. It was because it actually seemed like Florence cared about the soldiers, about her patients. She would spend every waking moment looking after the soldiers, and even through the night would check in on them to make sure everything was all good. Nowadays that's the norm for nurses. When I was in hospital a couple of months ago, I was woken up every couple of hours or so for night checks. But back in the 1800s, that wasn't really a thing. You were left to fend for yourself in hospital for the most part, even during the day. The fact that Florence Nightingale would walk around in the dark at night with a lamp just to make sure everyone was okay was unheard of. Hence her enduring nickname, the Lady with the Lamp. The soldiers were so moved by her apparent endless supply of compassion that they went home and told everyone who could listen about this incredible nurse. And her work in Crimea was reported on in the Times newspaper back at home as well. She was revered as a ministering angel. Some even called her the Angel of Crimea. Isn't it crazy to think now that back in the 1800s it was radical if a nurse actually cared about your well-being? Not only did Florence seem to care about the soldiers' physical well-being, but their mental as well. She created what was called the Invalid's Kitchen, where actually decent food was cooked, catering for patients with special dietary requirements as well. She established a laundry in the hospital so bedsheets and linens could actually be washed. She instituted a classroom and a library to allow for education and entertainment during the patients' long stays in hospital. While she was still in the Crimea, the Nightingale Fund was established back home during a public meeting for the training of nurses. It was an attempt to recognise her for the wonderful work that she was doing, and there were a huge amount of generous donations from the wealthy across the UK. That's how quickly the story of the Lady with the Lamp spread across the country. Florence returned after the war as a national hero, with fans across the entirety of Britain. People would literally send her fan mail, poems and letters they'd written, and across the UK, Florence merch started to pop up. Images of her were printed on bags, mats and souvenirs. Her sister Parthenope acted as her manager, collecting cuttings of newspapers and circulating information about Florence was up to family and friends. But she knew that her sister was a very private person, that she would refuse to consent to the release of photographs and pictures of herself. So the funniest thing to me is that most people making all of this merch probably had no idea what Florence actually looked like. Only 2 portraits had been drawn from life were released of Florence, but they were very expensive and not intended for the mass market. The irony of all of it is that Florence hated all of this attention. She saw herself as just a normal woman. To her it was a given that she would be a kind person to people who were struggling. It wasn't something to warrant celebrity, that she actually cared about people. Once back home, she kept as low a profile as possible and travelled under a pseudonym, Miss Smith. It turns out that one of Florence's biggest fans was actually Queen Victoria, who she actually ended up meeting in 1856. But the only thing that she wanted to use her fame for was to help in her mission to improve conditions in hospitals across the world. That's the only thing she wanted. Once back home, Florence used her talent in statistics to figure out the mortality rate in Crimea. She figured it was 1,174 per 10,000 troops, with 1,023 of these deaths being from zymotic diseases. If it had continued at this rate and troops hadn't been replaced frequently, then disease alone would have killed the entire British army in Crimea. Florence was sure that it was poor hygiene that caused this high level of deaths in hospitals, not just in Turkey but in the UK as well. She made it her purpose in life from there on out to improve sanitary conditions in hospitals and therefore stop the spread of disease. But this wasn't going to be as easy as you would think, because back in the 1800s most people subscribed to the theory of miasma, that diseases were caused by bad air, essentially that you would catch a disease through smelling something bad. Germ theory wasn't really a thing until after the 1880s. So poor Florence Nightingale trying to convince people the way to stop the spread of disease was just by washing your hands and generally being cleaner and keeping people apart was something that most people were never going to be able to wrap their heads around. Some people do say that Florence denied germ theory even herself, but regardless, she seemed to have the basic idea right. She collated all of her evidence and presented it in front of the Royal Commission of the Health of the Army, which she had managed to persuade Queen Victoria to set up. Florence knew that she was talented in statistics, but she needed a way to ensure that other people understood the numbers that she was trying to get across. It was literally a matter of life and death that she convinced the government to pay more attention to hospitals. So she used the statistical data that she collected in Turkey to create a polar area diagram, or coxcomb or rose diagram, whatever you want to call it. The central red wedges in this diagram show soldiers' deaths from wounds. The blue wedges represent deaths from preventable zoonotic diseases, and the black in between represent deaths from all other causes. The diagram on the right shows causes of mortality from April 1854 to March 1855, and then the left shows April 1855 to March 1856, illustrating a huge decline in fatalities following the work of the Sanitary Commission in Crimea. This diagram is super easy to understand, which meant at the time it was widely published and even the general public were able to understand what it was saying. The army was failing in its duty of care and there was an urgent need for change. In light of Florence's work here, new army medical, sanitary science and statistics departments were established to improve healthcare, including the setup of a new army medical college in Chatham. And on the back of this in 1860, Florence was elected as the first female fellow of the Statistical Society. By 1860, the Nightingale Fund that had been set up whilst Florence was still in Crimea had £45,000 just sitting there, which she decided to use to set up her own Nightingale training school at St Thomas's Hospital in London. It's still there now, called the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing and Midwifery, part of King's College London. Nightingale nurses were the start of a new generation, trained with the methods and ideas that Florence had pioneered. Nursing was no longer going to be deemed a job for drunks and prostitutes, it was going to be a respectable career. They were going to care. Their training was based around two key principles: that they should have practical training in hospitals specially organised for that purpose, and they should live in a home fit to form a moral life and discipline. Florence was strict. Nurses now had to be upstanding women. The year before opening the school, she'd written a book called Notes on Nursing that served as the cornerstone of the new school's curriculum, but was also designed to educate those learning at home. It sold really well, and updated versions of it are actually still used today when training nurses. On top of all this, Florence was also consulting with the British War Office's request for advice on army medical care over in Canada, and was also a consultant to the United States government on army health during the American Civil War. She even educated America's first trained nurse, Linda Richards, at the Nightingale Training School. And not only did Florence aim to improve medical care in hospitals, she also wanted to educate the regular person as to how they could best care for sick relatives and neighbours, teach them about sanitation in the household, and just teach them basic first aid. She sent trained nurses into workhouses in an attempt to make medical care readily available to everyone. Some people say this is the earliest version of the NHS, the UK's National Health Service. By the 1880s, Nightingale nurses were working at hospitals across the country, slowly changing the career and what it meant to be a nurse forever. In 1883, Florence became the first ever recipient of the Royal Red Cross from her now good friend, Queen Victoria. It was the highest of honours. And the most impressive thing about all of this? Even before her return from the Crimea, Florence had been chronically ill. Although her illness has intrigued historians for over 100 years, it's thought that her so-called Crimean fever was a form of chronic brucellosis. It was a form of infectious disease that caused Florence to be intermittently bedridden. For nearly 3 decades, she was barely able to get out of bed, complaining of fever, loss of appetite, fatigue, insomnia, irritability, depression, sciatica, shortness of breath, and heart palpitations. Her symptoms wouldn't start to fade until she was in her early 60s, which makes all of her accomplishments during that time from her return to the Crimea until her 60s even more impressive. She did most of her work in these years from her bed, and despite this she remained at the forefront of medical and social reform. She barely let anyone help her, not even letting her mother and sister come visit her during these years. But she wrote incessantly, and during this time she published over 200 books, reports and pamphlets, mostly on nursing, including Notes on Nursing. Towards the end of her life, she began struggling with her eyesight and her memory. Some report her as maybe suffering with Alzheimer's or dementia, but she continued to work, not as heavily as before, but she never stopped. For years she was involved in improving the health of the British Army over in India, emphasising the need for uncontaminated water supplies over there. By this point she was fully on board with germ theory. She campaigned for famine relief and improved sanitary conditions worldwide, receiving reports from India until 1906. In 1907, she became the first woman to be awarded the Order of Merit by King Edward. And then 3 years later, on the 13th of August 1910, at the age of 90, Florence Nightingale peacefully died in her sleep. the government offered her to be buried in Westminster Abbey in London, a huge honour. It's where pretty much only royalty and other significant British figures are buried. Charles Darwin, Stephen Hawking, Isaac Newton. But the Nightingale family knew that Florence hated the attention, she hated the celebrity, so they declined. She was buried at St Margaret's Church in Hampshire with a simple memorial featuring just her initials FN and her dates of birth and death. There's no denying that Florence Nightingale was an incredible woman. The world wouldn't be the world we know it to be today if she'd never existed. But she was a woman of means. She was upper middle class with all of the money she could ever need. And I think part of the reason why she captured the attention of the public so much was because the regular person marvelled at the fact that this rich woman who grew up travelling Europe and living on large estates would give up all of that just to care for people. But Florence herself never saw it like that. She saw her life as constraining. There were so many expectations on her as a woman to be educated but not too educated, to marry a rich man and have lots of children, to cook and clean and read and embroider. She never wanted any of that. She wanted to be as educated as she could be. She wanted to help care for others. She didn't ever want a husband. She broke boundaries in a time when it just wasn't the norm for women to do what they wanted, because she felt like she had this calling from God to do it. But as with everyone in history and in present day, Florence Nightingale was a woman of many layers, and she wasn't entirely perfect. Whilst many view her as a feminist icon, she wasn't really for the times. She was known for criticising women's rights activists of the time, who often complained there weren't enough jobs for women. Florence was upset by this because she was desperately trying to hire nurses, but people didn't seem all that interested. Because of this, she dismissed their complaints entirely. And although she had several close friendships with women, Florence made it clear that she preferred the friendship of men, mostly because they could get her further than a woman could, help her attain her goals. Which I suppose makes sense because women couldn't even vote back then, let alone help her up the career ladder. She wrote, "I have never found one woman who has altered her life by one iota for me or my opinions." Which brings me, I suppose, to rumours of Florence's sexuality. There are many people online who will fight the corner that Florence was a lesbian. She never married a man despite numerous proposals. She showed very little interest in men and did have very close friendships with women. But in all of my research, I couldn't find anything to really prove to me that Florence was a lesbian or queer in any way. She seemed to just be more interested in her calling from God than pursuing any romantic relationships. Maybe there might be more of an argument for her being asexual, but we'll never really know for sure. As much as I would love Florence to join the queer corner, she just didn't seem to be interested, and most people think she died a virgin. She wrote at one point that God had marked her out to be a single woman. And finally, I can't mention Florence Nightingale and the things she did for nursing without mentioning fellow nurse Mary Seacole. She was a British Jamaican woman who had heard about the conditions in the Crimea and applied to be sent over to help. But each application she made was rejected, so at the age of 50, Mary made her own way over there. Don't you worry, I will make a full video about Mary one day soon, but she essentially did just as much to help the British soldiers over in Crimea as Florence did. Every soldier over there knew of Mother Seacole, as they called her. There were many a rumour of frosty relationships between the two, with Mary writing in her own memoir that she had only one friendly meeting with Florence when she asked her for a bed for the night and got it. However, when she tried to get closer to Florence, she was rebuffed, and it has been inferred that racism was the problem here. Florence later wrote in a letter to her brother-in-law, "I had the greatest difficulty in repelling Mrs. Seacole's advances, and in preventing association between her and my nurses, which is absolutely out of the question. Anyone who employs Mrs. Seacole will introduce much kindness, also much drunkenness and improper conduct." Maybe Florence just didn't like her, maybe Florence was a little bit racist. But other reports say that Florence was actually fond of Mary, so once again, who knows? All in all, Florence Nightingale changed the course of the world. While she probably saved the lives of hundreds or maybe thousands of soldiers over in the Crimea, her fight to improve sanitation in hospitals in general has probably saved millions. Imagine where the world would be if Florence had never been born. I say it all the time, but that is exactly why history fascinates me so much. The entire course of the world is sometimes weighing on the shoulders of just one person. What one person alive today will change the course of the world over the next couple of centuries, for better or for worse. It boggles my mind, and it's important to remember that not only was Florence Nightingale an incredibly talented nurse, it wasn't her nursing alone that changed the world. It was her interest in maths and statistics, her willingness to learn, and her understanding of how to prevent the spread of disease in a world that didn't think along the same wavelength as her. Most women would never have been taught maths in this time. It was only because of her father's progressiveness that she was. Thank you so much for watching this video. Can you think of anyone else you want me to cover in this series? Perhaps just one person who changed the course of history forever? I love making these types of videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.